Okay, hi everybody. I'm Tony Zerbin. I'm a registered provisional psychologist, and I'm talking with Tara, who is a registered psychologist. And this
Yes.
is part three of our shame series. I believe it's part three. If you haven't seen the other two, I recommend that you check them out because we talk about a lot of things I think that we'll be touching on today. But today, I'm excited to kind of bridge this topic with you, shame and God. Right. So we're going to take it from a lot of different angles, but this is something that at first hand or at first glance, this is kind of the domain of clergy. So I want to recognize that. I want to walk carefully in that area, but I also want to bridge it because there's overlap between the work that we do and the work that clergy does. And there's places where they don't overlap, and that's also important. Shame and God. I've got some notes here, Tara. I'm afraid that I've got a few too many because I've got a lot that I like talking about here. But I'm also kind of curious. You've been thinking about this too. Where did you land with this when we talk about it?
Well, I think so. First off, I think Tony and I, it's important that we notice our sort of philosophy or experience of
Yeah.
faith. As I'm a Christian, I have a degree in theology from a very Christian school. Shout out Briarcrest Bible College, and so I like the study of God, and I like the study of Christian God and trying to understand it.
Mhm.
I've also been around a Christian environment for my whole life, so I'm I'm curious and also hold space for this connection between shame, our experience of shame, and how that informs our definition or view of God. Um,
Totally.
and then what I also like to lump in, connect in, is that the whole shame God connection is really tied into what we call spiritual abuse, which is a very
Yes.
important term that impacts almost all of us. If
Oh,
we have been
absolutely.
raised around religious environments, Christian, Buddhist, um, Orthodox, you name it, all sorts, New Age, any form of spirituality, there's potential for spiritual abuse.
Mhm.
So there's a lot. I mean, it's kind of like, where do we begin? What thread are we going to pull to start unraveling this giant topic?
I've got a place I'd like to start because I've
Excellent.
been thinking about it. Coming from the broader Christian tradition and really trying to hold space for the many different expressions of it, as well as working with clients that don't come from that tradition. Owning that and being clear on where I come from is super important.
Mhm.
One thing I want to talk about is because this is important. I was doing teaching in sometimes the sessionals for some schools, just more psychological health stuff. But I'd also take some of that to church youth groups too. So I got to see a lot of schools. I got to see a lot of youth groups, and through that process, talk with a lot of different church leadership. And shame is a really complicated and divisive term in the Christian community. So I want to talk about it a little bit and set some framework here. We talk about shame and God. When and kind of making a nod to the other two sessions that we've done. When I talk about shame and God, one thing I really want to highlight here is this idea of shame and other. And this is something that you can trace down through Christian tradition all the way back to the earliest writings. I mean, through the New Testament, through the Old Testament, but in continuity from then to now. And this idea of other and the Christianese term that I'm going to call for other would be holiness. And there's this sense that holiness is this recognition of the otherness of God. And our experience of God more fully almost always shows up as an experience inside viscerally, physiologically, as an experience of shame. What? Hey, isn't there's no shame in God. There's no shame in being a new creation. I have a lot of compassion for this one pastor I encountered when I said, "Hey, I want to talk with kids about healthy shame," and he that was a trigger point for him. There was no category for a Christian life with shame. So respecting that that's some people's experience, I want to unpack this a little bit today.
And I think just noticing that is an example of spiritual abuse that there is often in religious organizations,
Mhm.
a message that's put forward that if you feel ashamed, there's something wrong with you. But what I think I hear you saying just right now, Tony, is that sometimes when we see God and we're like, God is perfect, God is good, God is all these things, then somehow in my own experience of my humanity and my realization of my ungoodness,
Mhm.
it just feels so unattainable.
Mhm.
And of course, that's shame.
Yes. So I've got three examples we can talk about right off the cuff where this shows up actually in scripture.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first ones I could think of is this image, this vision that the prophet Isaiah had when he was approaching God in the temple. And he's like, woe is me. Like, oh my gosh, I'm not worthy to be here. I'm being undone. This is not like only the high priest can approach God like this in this place.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, only once a year. I'm not even a priest. What am I doing here? And he's like, I'm going to be undone. And then this angel comes in and puts coal in his lips. And this is burning coal, which is the sense of, okay, yes, and God is meeting you in your shame. You're recognizing just viscerally that you're being undone. And there's also the sense that shame can meet the purification of God.
And that's actually what you're tying together. And it can be confusing or hard to understand, is you're actually saying, hey, here's a message. This is a very valuable message in Christian literature, which is the Bible, that says God knows we have shame and he meets us in our shame.
Mm-hmm.
That's powerful for people who have endured judgment.
Mm-hmm.
There's something wrong with you you should be ashamed of yourself for being ashamed.
Oh my goodness. Well, I want to talk about two more quick biblical examples, just so people can track that. But then there's something there I really want to touch on too, just with this idea of spiritual abuse. The two other examples I want to highlight is Peter after the resurrection. He ran away at the crucifixion, right? He denied Christ 3 times. And then when Jesus met him later, he was on a boat and Jesus was on the shore. And then Peter's like, who is that guy? And then Jesus talked with him. He's like, this is Jesus. Oh my goodness. And then he says, I think he like throws off his robe. He jumps in the water. He swims to Jesus. And he says, leave me. I'm a person of unclean lips. Yep. Right? Or maybe it wasn't earlier. At one point, Peter talks to Jesus and says, hey, well, I recognize who you are. And the moment I recognize who you are, I can't be near you. I'm being undone. And again, this is the visceral experience of shame. And Jesus says, okay, that's your experience. I'm calling you forward. So at this boat experience, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And Jesus calls out Peter's love 3 times over. And again, it's this Isaiah moment of shame's coming, shame's real, it's there. And Peter had walked with Jesus for 3 years at this point. He knew, and Jesus had said in the upper room, hey, you guys are clean, right? Yeah. But at that moment, there was still this experience of shame. And Jesus met him in his shame.
I think that's really, really powerful too, Tony, this second story of like, Peter, he really did some shameful things. He denied Jesus on the night that Jesus was taken to be crucified. And he didn't recognize Jesus when Jesus came back to life after 3 days. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, shame all over you, Peter. Then Jesus, still uses him. Like Peter is a great example of somebody who's human. He had a lot of humanity that is written about, and he helped a lot of people. So there's no perfect person, and that's another important remark when we're looking at these Bible stories.
Yeah.
Okay, number 3. I don't want you to lose track. Number 3.
Oh, good. And then I'll talk about
everything. You'll talk about everything.
Oh my gosh, Tara, we could do 3 sessions like this. 3
I know. 3 million.
But I want it to be useful for other people if they can watch it too. So the third one is the Apostle John when he's been exiled to the island. And this is the opening of the book of the Revelation. And he's standing there. He's been faithful serving God from as long back as he encountered Jesus. And he'd been exiled for his faith. And you'd think, hey, this guy, he's had time to work himself out. He's had time to get right with God. He cleaned up and then he was able to meet God, right? Oh man, right? So there he is. And he comes and he has this encounter, vision or something. The language is purposely ambiguous with Jesus. And he sees him. And he was the beloved disciple. He was the one who was as close as anybody humanly could have been to God, maybe apart from Mary. I don't know. But he shows up. And then he sees Jesus in his fully glorified form, Jesus fully as God and present in front of him. And he says, he collapsed on the ground. He fell on his face as if he was dead. And again, this is like a full bore experience of shame. Just total loss of bodily control, total recognition of other, and how other was so much. I'm going to say something controversial in the sense that there's a hierarchy there. And that God is so far above him that he has such a hard time measuring up.
Or
and Jesus
yeah. Or go ahead.
Right, yeah. So then Jesus looks at him, and what does Jesus do? How does Jesus respond to John collapsing on the ground?
I can't remember.
He picks him up. He says, hey, you don't need to be afraid. I'm here with you. You can see me as I am. You can be with me. You can recognize all your shame. And I'm not going anywhere. You can be with me. Right?
It's powerful. And then it's what I like to, when you bring up John, what gets me excited is, John's shame was really like his exile, his imprisonment, all these things were really man shaming him. And I hadn't really thought about that with Peter or with Elijah's story, but it's like the human view of what is shame. And then we don't really take more time to consider what might be a theology or God's view of our shame, which is actually God just keeps meeting us in our unmeetable places.
Yeah.
And
that's hard for us.
It's hard for us, and religion so often gets it wrong. So when you say other about God, that grandeur.
Yeah.
Glory be to God. That grandeur thing. That there's a grandeur and an awesomeness, a brilliance. When I hear you say other, I think of it sits different with me in regards to shame, because so often we lose sight of hope and faith and gratitude and all that stuff that belongs to a relationship with God.
Yeah.
And other becomes sort of more Sunday school experience for me. I hear it more of like what's right, what's wrong, what's black, what's white. Who's bad, who's good. There's this old narrative that so many people are taught early in formative years about morality. What is moral? What is rightness? And then what is wrong becomes other. There's the other.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, this is how shame shows up unintentionally and can get weaponized and become abusive, right? And we can come in with the morality that's appropriate for a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old. And even then, there's questions I have there about how appropriate it is. But for a lot of people, the Sunday school experience never gets augmented anywhere else in their faith. And it's not an appropriate level of nuance for people who are 10 years old, 20 years old, 60 years old, 80 years old. This is a family developmental challenge in terms of even attachment literature, right? Is how do we meet our family members as they change in a way that's appropriate to where they're at?
Yeah, and then I think too, it's like, Jesus says, let the little children come. He doesn't say sit them in a classroom and teach them about who's going to hell.
Right.
I mean, I'm sorry, I don't think I still am traumatized by what I got taught about heaven and hell and when I was 8 years old. Like, it's just not necessary. It's not the design. But more of the design, I think, is what you're talking about, Tony, is like, how do we help people to see a spiritual experience with a God who is love,
Hmm.
who's saying, let me meet you in your fear, let me meet you in your shame and your complicated emotion, your confusing emotion, your more than one feeling at a time stuff.
Yeah.
And that's not about rules. That's not about right and wrong. That's about meeting.
Oh, exactly. And this is the perfect place for the other thing I wanted to talk about
Mm-hmm.
is in a lot of our shared heritage and a lot of Western Christianity. I'm learning about Eastern Christianity. I can't speak authoritatively. I mean, Lord have mercy. I don't know if I can speak authoritatively about either of them. But one thing that I see a real challenge in the common language around shame is that the Christian message really focuses on forgiveness. And forgiveness is really good about rules and about guilt. If I
Yes.
feel guilty about something, forgiveness is the appropriate response. It's a legal, juridical model. Shame is not at the same level as guilt. And this is why I like differentiating language with clients, even
Mm.
apart from religious context, but especially in religious context. Because in the tradition I grew up in, if people recognized that they were not in a place where they wanted to be with God, they would go to essentially a confessional bench and they would rededicate their life to God. And in part of that process, they would say, this is where I don't measure up in my relationship to God. This is where I want to improve. This is where I want to be right with God, whatever language you want to dress it up in. And then the message they'd get is, well, you're forgiven. And they'd go up sometimes repeatedly to the same confessional bench. And they'd be like, something just doesn't feel right. And you say I'm forgiven, and somehow I feel bad. And sometimes you saying I feel forgiven or that I'm forgiven makes me feel worse. Because here's what happens: you can't forgive shame.
Mm.
If you forgive shame and somebody feels bad after you've forgiven shame, they're just going to be ashamed, more ashamed of their shame,
That's brilliant. You can't
right?
forgive shame, and shame needs to be spoken,
Yeah, it needs to be held and witnessed.
held, and witnessed. And that's what like William Paul Young
Yeah,
really advocates
yeah.
for is like no more secrets, no more secrets. Like I need to like have all my shame stuff. I'm like, oh, right?
Yeah.
Probably with another human being. And then with God, because there's this thing a lot of us do, especially spiritually, that
Yeah.
we hide it all. It's like, ooh, everybody else looks so perfect. I better not tell them that I swear. And way worse.
I'll share with the shame that I'm okay sharing. I don't want to. I mean, okay. I want to unpack something here with you because this is exactly where I was hoping to go to, and you're right there too.
Mm-hmm.
Shame, forgiveness being what it is, it's important too. Don't get me wrong. It's good to know that you've been forgiven for what you've done. Because guilt's about what you've done. Shame is about who you are. In this case, right? It really gets under that. You can't forgive that. So there's loads of biblical language there that we could unpack. But one way I want to step into it is shame needs to be met in relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is what makes it really hard for us with our limitations, trying to approach God to get a sense of, okay, I can pray this prayer, God, sorry, I went over the speed limit, or I don't know, whatever people end up praying to God about in these kinds of cases, whatever really gets us feeling our shame. This is where the community, where you and I, where the whole place of confession and pastors and priests and these people step in is because of our limits. It's through each other that we get to encounter God. It's nice to be able to encounter God on our own, but the biblical model is always with each other, and our healing happens with each other. And it's oftentimes the place of our hurt and our wounding is where we need to be met. And so you go back to Peter, and Jesus said, hey, you denied me 3 times, but I'm going to hold space for you and invite you to affirm your love for me. How many times? 3 times over as well.
And I think too, like that experience together is so important because what would I say to Peter? You know, like Jesus is like, I love you, brother. Go out and do a ton of good stuff.
Yeah.
But if I was there, I think I would have like
Peter,
really
get down to
judged. I would have judged him. I'd have been like, you loser. Like you knew the guy, like betrayal central, Peter. Or even John. You know, like
Yeah,
John wrote his books in exile. And so
yeah,
I'm like, would I read the prison testimony? You know, like I think that that's where this spiritual abuse thing and like the human, so my human experience of judging your morality, because when I see God's
yeah,
goodness and then I start judging and shaming myself, it's hard to have grace
exactly.
and restoration, to have that experience together.
Exactly. So let's hold this for a sec here, because
Sure, sure.
this is the perfect place to begin pivoting into spiritual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
What we see Genesis, creation of Adam and Eve, there's this wonderful expression where God says, "You're made in my image." Right? Now, this has a rich heritage in Christian history. The image, the icon, is a way of encountering the presence.
Mm.
And icons in particular, in my study of Eastern Christianity, is really this idea that you're encountering God through the witness of somebody else. And this is why being in relationship with people who are in touch with God is so important, is because they get to be the physical manifestation to you of the love of God,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's when things are in the proper order. This is why the great commandment is love God with everything and love your neighbor. It's equal
Yeah.
to that, because it's Isaiah has language of this again, of when you love your brother as yourself, that's an act of worship of God.
But I have a question for you because I had a note on
Okay.
the same thing, because I was thinking of that, you know, like when I'm thinking about love, God, what is love? Second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself,
Mhm.
which Brian Zahn would say is justice.
Mhm.
So what do you think, Tony? I have questions for you. I didn't tell you I was gonna have. What do you think about justice versus shame, justice and shame? Like how do you process that?
So I can speak to it with the the knowledge of an amateur and in the fullness of what amateur means, of somebody who studies from a passion, not necessarily as a full scholar. But justice, as I've come to understand it from cross-culturally to ancient Greeks, ancient Hebrews, justice, particularly as a biblical idea, is not the legal justice that we know in the modern Western world. It's not 18th century German court system justice. Justice, um, in a biblical model, more often than not, is about how do we bring wholeness back to relationships? How can we be full in connection again? And what process does that look like? So the justice of God is about bringing back the fullness of relationship and meeting us in all the places where we deny each other the fullness of relationship.
That's
Because
beautiful.
if Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, they were meant to be God's proxy, God's conduit into creation and to each other. And me and you are trying to represent God to each other. The Apostle Paul says, I labor for you until Christ be formed in you. And it's mother language there. It's growing baby language.
Mm.
We're like little Marys in a way, that we our goal in life is to embody God. And
Yeah.
this is beautiful because we can encounter each other in each other's shame and hold God's love for each other. That's good and that's right. And that goes beyond morality. That goes down to the stomach of relationship.
Well, and it sounds like what you know that beautiful, that justice is about creating wholeness, which I also love, comparing to the three stories you brought up. And when you notice shame in each of those stories, you would metaphor it as I'm undone, I'm undone. You know, I'm
Mhm.
undone in my shame, and then
Mhm.
I have this experience of love your neighbor as yourself,
Mhm.
and there's a wholeness in that we experience together, which
Mhm.
then does something for how we view God,
Yeah.
or and how, like, because we're even in this conversation, we're so in humanity.
Yeah.
Like it's hard to like pop out of humanity and sort of be in that experience of how God is viewing all of this. But just noticing the human experience and what we do with
Yes.
shame. Shame is the opposite of love your neighbor. Shame is the opposite of love yourself.
Well, and here's something I want to talk about, and I want to be very clear about this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is a bit of a sidebar because I want to get back to the idea of spiritual abuse. We've teed it up really well here,
Mm-hmm.
but shame as an experience that we have in our daily lived life is a gift, right? If we didn't have shame, we could be crystallized in the most anti-human, anti-relationship ways.
Right.
So to be continually pursuing God is also to be continually becoming more sensitive to our shame, because those are our opportunities to be aware of where we still lack wholeness in relationships.
I like that.
So to not have shame, to deny ourselves shame, to say that once you've encountered Christ, you don't need shame anymore. In reality, I mean, it's a beautiful idea, but in reality, I can't line that up with scripture, and I can't line that up with my experience. And hey, I know my experience is incomplete and broken, so hold that intention. But in reality, this is what growth looks like as we become more full.
Yeah, yeah. And then it's again, I'm William Paul Young. I just recently heard him talk about kind of like we're spiraling, like
Mm.
we're moving. It's not like this circle relationship with God, which we might use a circle to describe an attachment relationship,
Right, right.
parent child. But it's like we're always kind of
Yeah.
so in that process, chrysalis, metamorphosis, transformation, however we're viewing it, it's a continuum. So I get a bit of it, and then I keep going, and I get a bit more, and I get a bit more of that embodying of what this love,
Hmm.
God's love. And so shame is necessary, the good shame. I should feel a bit of like, oh, drop in my gut
Yeah.
when I realize I I I I still struggle with love my neighbor as myself. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's hard. It's hard. Who's going to master that before the grave?
Well, and I mean, it's a process of seeing your neighbor both. I mean, this language both ways in scripture, both as yourself and as other from yourself.
Yes.
And the more we become aware of that, the more we can move into conscious wholeness with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I love myself, I'm going to love my neighbor. But if I see my neighbor as other than me, I'm also taking care of them.
And who is your neighbor? That's part of it. There's a whole parable on that one, but it's
That
like
parable is a follow up to the Great Commandment.
yes,
It's literally meant to go together with it as an explainer.
because everyone's our neighbor. Russian soldiers are our neighbors. People who are I personally find difficult to love are my neighbor. Well, there's people all over, and this is part of the spiritual abuse, black and white, good and bad, Sunday school teaching, is that
Yes.
it teaches children that there are the good people and the bad people. And so then what do I do with the bad people?
Yeah. Right. It's an other unto death rather than an other unto pursuit. Recognizing the otherness of God is our pursuit of Him.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing the otherness of our neighbor is our pursuit of them. But if we choose to intentionally otherify, I'm making that up,
Yes.
somebody else, that's to, that's to kick them out, to dissolve relationships, maybe to tighten other ones, but it's to say, I don't want to be a part of you.
Yeah, and it fits with that poop and run thing that I talked about in previous videos, where it's like I touch my shame and I poop and run. I touch your shame and I poop and run. So I meet
Yeah.
somebody on the street who is bad,
Yeah.
and I touch their shame, and then whatever I do, judge, you
Yeah.
know, like say something, some stupid Christian thing to them to like push them away.
Yeah.
Because if I touch their shame, then I have to notice my own shame,
Yeah.
or vice versa. When I'm, you know, being a normal person doing things that are normal,
Right. I
and
mean,
they, yeah, go ahead.
this is the beauty of the parable of the Good Samaritan
Mm-hmm.
is the good religious persons, and there was two or three of them that crossed the path of this wounded, broken person. The good religious ones walked around.
Yeah.
They crossed the other side of the street because their disgust reflex was activated. And they're like, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with uncleanness. There's
Yeah.
shame language too. And then the Good Samaritan shows up and says, I'm not even thinking about clean or unclean right now. I got to take care of my neighbor.
Yeah. So I want to share something with you. That's in a preface into talking about shame and spiritual abuse. So I'm going to share my screen.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Hopefully you can see it. You can see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is I got permission from David Hayward, the Naked Pastor. He has a lot of great stuff about shame, different types of shame. A big advocate for the LGBTQ community, and all sorts of people who have endured spiritual abuse. So when we're talking about shame and spiritual abuse and God, great question is: do you view violence as an attribute of God?
Mm.
And this is a huge like thing. It's like if I believe that God is violent, then I can continue on with this us versus them mentality. I can see what is black and white. But the truth in this little image here of the paper chain dolls is this is, you know, this is what violence does. This is what shame does. And they're synonymous. Violence and shame, especially spiritual violence, is synonymous with shame. And then this was one that David shared just, I think, today. But so relevant. I'm like, could you have a more loaded message in a pencil sketch? But this idea of if I determine to do violence, I make up my mind I'll be violent. If I make up my mind I'll be shaming, and I paste a cross on it, then somehow I can believe I'm right. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah. And it's an us versus them.
Us versus them mentality. And there's, you know, there's no them, just us, to quote Brian Zand again. I'm going to close these. So, like, considering this you know, what is violence? What is shame? How does that all fit with God? And then the spiritual abuse piece.
Yeah. Okay. So we've teed it up.
We've totally teed it up.
And it's important to do because it's such a one of the biblical ways of talking about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, what's healthy and what's unhealthy is oftentimes through inversions, right? I'm going to show you something that works, and I'm going to show you something that doesn't work. But I'm not going to tell you it doesn't work. I'm going to show you how it doesn't work. And what we see is we're given man, Adam and Eve, created in image of God, that whole kind of business, right? And they image God by loving. Our role is to convey a love of God to people, to meet them in their shame with the love of God that doesn't run away. We run away. God doesn't run away.
He doesn't poop and run.
Nothing surprises him. Surprises us. So here's the beautiful message that shows up in Christian community is, well, we get to confess to each other and hold each other, love each other, and express the love of God to each other. And you see it as a good thing, a healthy thing, a right thing to meet each other in our shame with love, right? And the more we represent God to each other, the more beautiful it can be. Or, let's invert it, the more destructive it can be. So if you have somebody who represents God to you and shames you and others you and judges you, it's not only the abuse of them doing it, it's spiritual abuse because they also represent God to you.
Definitely. That's well said.
Every kind of abuse that we can experience, if it's done in connection, in association with God and changes how we view God because of somebody representing God,
Mm-hmm.
is a spiritual abuse then.
Yeah,
Because
and that
God, they're close to God, and their abuse of me is got to be somehow representing their closeness to God too. So who
we
is God?
it, we and this is so fitting with David's art. And we see the cross and we forget to notice the missile that it is attached to.
Yeah.
And there's this humanness, and we're all fragile, and we're all people like everybody else. Sometimes we're good, sometimes we're bad. And so there's people in leadership and in church leadership
Yeah.
that are afraid of being bad, and they're saying, I have to have all the answers. And it's like,
I gotta look shiny.
I gotta look shiny. And that's a lot of pressure, and especially if we expect ourselves to have all the answers. Like
Mm-hmm.
you and I, Tony, are in the field of no answers.
Right. The longer I'm in the field, the more I'm like, whoa, I've seen enough to hold space.
To hold space. And we talk a lot about theory and things, but we sure don't. I mean, we sure don't have answers. We just have people, and and I love how you said that. Like as humans, our experience when we touch someone else's shame is I want to run, but God doesn't run, and we don't know that.
No. How we have limits. How can we know that unless we experience it through somebody else?
Beautiful.
You look at scripture. God, every time he acts,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of any examples. And I could be wrong. Somebody who's more theologically astute can correct me here. I'm open to that. I want to be open to that. Is every time God acts, he's acting through somebody else. And the more closely they represent him, the more the language starts to get blurred between God acting. Is it this person acting? Right? And that's an imaging thing.
All I know for sure about the Bible right now is that it's a book full of stories about people who almost all of them are pretty screwed up. That's like where I'm like, why is that important? I don't know. I have a question about it, but I want to ask you a question here. So, again, just like I was thinking how I want to pick your brain. What do you think about, so when we're talking about spiritual abuse or experience in religious environments, how do you think that religion impacts our ability to self-regulate?
Should we make this a series?
Should we come back to that one? It's big. I know it's big. You don't have a nice 2-sentence answer.
If you give me a moment. Okay. I've got something for today. We can revisit it again and maybe flesh it out a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
There was a large movement of I love God but not religion coming out. And it brought some really valid and valuable critique to the things that are going on. What challenges I have with that statement is, as cathartic as it is, we throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Perfect.
And this is where I'm in process, and I want to own that, right? Yeah. I'm very vulnerable in saying that. Like, I'm in my own faith, really in process and transitioning here, because this is very, very specifically the question I'm grappling with, is how does religion help us regulate or not?
Yeah,
so,
or not, yeah.
Or not, right? And that's what I care about as a therapist, as somebody who cares about the healing of people. I care about the frameworks that we hold people in. We work very hard as therapists to set up our offices in ways that facilitate healing. Where we sit is important in that. How we talk and how we don't talk is important in that. So an expression I heard the other day is along the lines of doctrine, what we believe about God informs our ethics. and our ethics inform how we treat each other. So our doctrine matters, and what holds the vessel that holds doctrine with any kind of stability and continuity is religion.
Yeah.
Right? Religion is given as a gift. You see this as the Leviticus and no, sorry, Exodus and Leviticus. This is why I love Leviticus even. It's a, I mean, oh, we could have a long conversation about that too. But it's this idea that in these packed rituals and liturgies and symbols is something that can hold something bigger than a systematic theology.
Yes.
Systematic theology is too small to hold religion. They're not the same thing. It can be an index into religion. But religion is the framework that says, okay, here's God's condescension to us, to meet us in our fullness, so that we can meet him in his fullness. And if we don't have religion, one thing that I'm grappling with is, say, the Reformation, for example. It was a valid and valuable critique of a system that was broken, right? There's a lot of really important good things that came from it. One of the things that I'm grappling with is that a lot of the stability in religion was lost at the Reformation. In Martin Luther's own lifetime, because the framework of religion was being dismantled, there was huge fractionation that happened. Fracturing, making up words on left, right, and center here.
I like that fractionation word. It works for me.
Right? And he lamented by the end of his life, he's like, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. We weren't supposed to have 60 denominations in my own lifetime.
Yeah.
We were supposed to be one, and I was advocating for the one. I never wanted to be separate from the one. I was isolated from the one. Right? The Christian message is Jesus reconciling all things, making wholeness in all things into himself. And without religion, we run into each other and say, well, I've got the right way, and no, you've got the right way, or I've got the right way. And you've got a lot of people without a framework that holds them, without a framework that's bigger than them.
I like what you're saying, Tony, and the simple answer that I heard you say that really works for me is that either religion helps us to self-regulate or it does not. And when you're talking about religion, because there's the church and then there's religion, and those are two theological different things. But within religion is the sacraments. And if we are taught and held in space with the sacraments in a loving way with God and not a rule-based way, they are self-regulating anchors. So if religion is done with the love of God and without spiritual abuse, then it is self-regulating.
And can I make a key distinction here?
Definitely.
If it doesn't meet you in your shame, I don't think it can regulate you. If it placates you, then Marx was right. It's the opiate of the masses. If it can bring out your shame and meet you in your shame, then that's a place of healing. And I think there's a really important distinction to make there. If your religion is as small as you or as small as your pastor, I get really worried that it's too small.
That's really good.
If it doesn't hold something bigger than you that you can't grasp, that you have to grapple with, are you the image of perfection?
Well, and I can't remember who I heard say this. It was I just been listening to so many theologians lately.
Me too.
But when somebody said, like when we're children, we know what awe is. So like the new Disney film Red Panda came out, and I was watching the preview with my son, and his little face, he was like, just utter awe watching the preview. He had to watch it 3 times because I wouldn't let him watch it until the next evening. And he's just like, oh my word, what is this? But what children experience of awe, by the time we get to, for sure by our late 20s, it's kind of like, what's awesome anymore?
Isn't that a shame?
That is an utter shame. That's good shame. Because we should, awe is that is the magnitude of love,
Yeah.
and God is love. God is all good.
Awe is this almost the same physiology as shame. And if we
Yeah,
cannot be with our shame, we lose our awe. And what are we left with? This is, I think,
yeah.
part of what Nietzsche was getting at when he was truly lamenting what he
Mm,
was saying. God is dead, and woe are we, because without that higher focusing point, left to our own devices,
mhm.
we're gonna he he foresaw the crisis of the past 150 years.
Definitely.
God's dead was not a joyful shout for him. It
No,
was,
and
but it was not joyful because
yeah,
when we lose awe, we lose our ability to worship.
yes, yes,
We
and the experience of awe allows us to experience in that moment. You see a little child who's like, awesome. They're in a visceral experience. But to bringing up Nietzsche, which I love that you did, I just like Ukraine. It's a godless situation. You know, war is godless. It's man-made. It's horrendous
yeah
what's going on when we notice the news. But what is amazing is Father Kenneth, who was on our vlog a while back. I saw him. I learned from him. He did a beautiful presentation on icons, current iconographers, all Ukrainian. And
yeah
then he gave a list of them all for Instagram, and I follow all these people. And then I've just been following Ukrainian artists. The Ukrainian people are artistic. They're dancers.
yeah
They're painters. They're brilliant filmographers. It's just beautiful culture. And in this darkness, to
yeah
see people um, finding some awe enough to create icons, to create art, to express a voice of pain and hope. I just saw somebody's art today. They did this beautiful collage of like
Mhm.
the progression through this war and to their final image of hope. And that's some of it is like when we see people in utter pain, and there's a hope and there's an awe and there's an expectation for love,
yeah
unashamed expectation for love.
yeah yeah so I'm going through an interesting book. It's by a writer, I'm forgetting his name right now, Timothy Patsitsas. It's called the Ethics of Beauty, and he's on these themes right here. I mean, the iconography, the awe, and he talks about what was classically known as the transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty.
Mm.
Right? And he says if you're a truth first culture, I mean, you can have a tyranny that goes with it. Truth without goodness and without beauty. If you're goodness, I mean, our APA ethics models built deontologically, there's virtues in there, and it's got to also be applicable, right? And these things are all together. But beauty has the capacity to heal, and it heals in part through recognizing our otherness and stepping into awe. And that is the restorative shame. It's the being on top of a mountain, feeling small, seeing the sunrise or the sunset. It's like, I'm tiny, I'm insignificant, I'm other than that. And that is awesome.
It is awesome.
Being undone and redone all at once. So if there's no awe, if there's no worship, or what we worship is how we heal
Yeah.
our own. I mean, you got the shame of abuse, but you have the shame of healing.
Yes. And I just think, like that, the beauty and awe of just like the awesomeness
Mm-hmm.
is such an awesome little image. For me, I felt awe, and that's why I asked David if I could share it here, is because it's like I got something inside of me. I felt an experience when I saw this little image of like, that makes so much sense
Mm-hmm.
for spiritual abuse, for shame.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you know what, Tony? I think we'll do a fourth part of our shame stuff and just tie a big old fat bow all over this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be studying this. Your questions really just pull out so much more. I appreciate the way you interview. You
I
hold back.
appreciate our conversation.
It's a shame to cut it short.
I know, right? I mean, okay. You know what, brother? Love you, brother.
Right back at you, Tara.
All right. Take care, Tony. And there's a lot in this, you guys. It's a powerful piece to just start having questions about. None of us have good answers. I mean,
No,
somebody might, but I haven't found that person. I like the people with the big questions.
yeah, I think. I mean, if I have a closing thought,
Do it.
it's just to being with open hands to approach something other than you.
Yes.
And when the shame comes up, that can very much be the part of healing.
Yeah.
And it's about how we meet each other in connection. Forgiveness, morals, they're important, they're good, but it's that deeper level that we need healing at,
Yeah.
that each of us gets to be a part of.
Yeah. And look for the other and realize that it is a
Good.
very powerful thing. Yeah. Both
True, it is good, it is beautiful.
true is good and beautiful. Okay. Thanks, Tony.
Take care, Tara.